Good evening. What I want to do today is take you beneath the surface of what's happening in Moscow, because what the media tells you, what the official narratives tell you, is only a fraction of the story. And frankly, it's the fraction designed to obscure what's really going on. When ordinary people take to the streets in a country like Russia, a country with a notoriously powerful security apparatus, a country where protest carries real risk, imprisonment, harassment, violence, you can be absolutely certain that something profound has shifted in the economic and social foundations of that society. This isn't spontaneous anger. This isn't a moment of passion that will pass. This is the eruption of decades-long contradictions finally reaching a breaking point. Let me be very clear about something. The surface-level explanations you're hearing don't hold up under scrutiny. The Western media wants to tell you it's about democracy versus authoritarianism. The Russian government wants to tell you it's about foreign interference and Western-backed destabilization. But if you believe either of these narratives, you're missing the economic engine driving all of this. And that's the point I want to make crystal clear. Economics is not separate from politics. Economics is the foundation upon which all politics rests. When we look at what's happening in Moscow, what we're actually witnessing is the manifestation of a fundamental contradiction in how Russia's economy is organized, a contradiction that has been building for decades, and that no amount of political rhetoric or security force deployment can permanently suppress. Here's what I mean. Imagine you're running a system where the wealth generated by millions of workers is systematically diverted to a tiny elite class. Imagine that this process happens not through overt slavery, which everyone would recognize and resist, but through the normal functioning of markets, through free contracts, through what appears to be legitimate economic activity. That's capitalism. And that's what Russia has been experiencing since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Soviet system, whatever its failures, had certain mechanisms for distributing resources relatively evenly across the population. There were housing guarantees, there were jobs, there was universal education and health care. These systems created what sociologists call a social contract, an implicit agreement between the state and its citizens that said, you work, you contribute to society, and in return, society takes care of your basic needs. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia embraced capitalism, or more accurately, a particular brutal form of capitalism we might call oligarchic capitalism, that social contract was shattered. What emerged instead was a system designed to enrich a small political and economic elite while the vast majority of Russians saw their living standards collapse. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a failure of capitalism to work properly. This was capitalism working exactly as designed. And that's the crucial point. Let me explain how this system actually works, because it's essential to understanding why people are now in the streets. In the 1990s, when Russia transitioned from Soviet to capitalist economy, a process occurred that economists call privatization. Now, that word, privatization, it sounds neutral, almost technical. But let me translate what actually happened. State assets, the factories, the oil fields, the natural resources, the enterprises that had been collectively owned were transferred into the hands of a small number of politically connected oligarchs. This wasn't a free market process. This wasn't millions of Russians bidding for these assets. This was a coordinated transfer of wealth from the public to the private hands of people with political connections, people close to power, people who could make deals. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, Western advisors, they all told Russia this was the path to prosperity. Privatize everything, they said. Let the market work its magic. But what actually happened was something quite different. The market didn't distribute resources efficiently. It concentrated them in the hands of those who already had power. And here's where the fundamental contradiction emerges. Once these oligarchs controlled the productive assets, they needed a political structure to protect their wealth They needed a state that would secure their property rights, that would suppress labor organizing, that would ensure they could extract maximum profit from the workers they employed. So what you see in Russia is a tight alliance between economic oligarchs and political power. The oligarchs enrich the politicians. The politicians use state power to protect the oligarchs' wealth. It's a beautiful arrangement if you're part of the elite. But what about everyone else? What about the hundreds of millions of ordinary Russians? Well, they work. They work in factories, in offices, in shops, in hospitals, in schools. They create value. They generate the surplus that's extracted by both the capitalist owners and the state apparatus. And in exchange, they receive wages. Now, here's the key. Those wages are kept as low as possible. Why? Because higher wages mean lower profits for the owners. And in a capitalist system, the fundamental drive, the imperative, is to maximize profit, to extract as much surplus value as possible from the labor of workers. So you have this situation. Productivity is increasing in many sectors of the Russian economy, but wages are stagnating. Work intensifies, but compensation doesn't keep pace. Workers are producing more value, but receiving less of it. Meanwhile, the wealth at the top is exploding. The oligarchs are buying yachts, acquiring properties in London and New York, sending their children to private schools in Switzerland. They're living like the global 1% because they are the global 1%. They're integrated into the international capitalist system, moving money between tax havens, leveraging their connections for international deals. And the contradiction becomes more and more visible, more and more intolerable. Because in modern economies, you can't keep people completely ignorant anymore. They see the gleaming towers being built by oligarch-connected corporations. They see their own children unable to afford housing. They see public hospitals crumbling while private clinics serve the wealthy. They see pensions that don't cover basic expenses while billionaires multiply their fortunes. The social contract has broken down completely. The state no longer delivers security and stability in exchange for political loyalty. Instead, what you have is a state apparatus that's entirely captured by oligarchic interests, using its monopoly on violence to protect a system that's systematically immiserating the majority of the population. That's the foundation. That's the economic base. Everything else, the politics, the ideology, the narratives, flows from this. Now let's talk about what's actually happened to the material conditions of ordinary Russians over the past decade or so. Real wages, and I want to emphasize real, meaning adjusted for inflation, have stagnated. In some sectors, they've actually declined. Now, the Russian government and state media will show you statistics that claim growth, but those statistics often obscure what's actually happening in people's lives. You see, when you're making a salary that hasn't meaningfully increased in 5 or 10 years, but the prices of everything you need have risen significantly, you're experiencing a real decline in your standard of living. It doesn't matter what the GDP figures say. What matters is, can you afford food? Can you afford heating in winter? Can you afford medicine? Can you afford to send your children to school? For millions of Russians, the answer to these questions has become increasingly no. Let's talk about inflation specifically. Inflation is what happens when the money in your pocket loses purchasing power. It's like a silent thief stealing from workers. Unlike a visible tax that you can see and protest, inflation operates quietly. You don't notice it day to day, but over months and years, it eats away at your ability to survive. In Russia, inflation has been a persistent problem, particularly affecting essential goods, food, fuel, utilities. When a pensioner receives a pension that was calculated 10 years ago, and that pension hasn't increased proportionally with inflation, that pensioner is now poorer in real terms. Their purchasing power has declined. This is the lived experience of economic crisis for ordinary people. It's not abstract, it's not theoretical. It's the choice between buying medicine or buying groceries. It's the choice between heating your apartment or feeding your family. And here's where I want to connect this to the broader analysis. This isn't happening because of bad luck or bad management. This is happening because of the fundamental structure of how the Russian economy is organized. Because in a capitalist system, the drive for profit supersedes all other considerations. When you have an economy that's heavily dependent on oil and gas exports, and Russia absolutely does, you become vulnerable to global market fluctuations. When oil prices fall on the international market, government revenues decline, which means government spending declines, which means public services deteriorate, and workers' wages don't keep up with inflation. But here's the thing. The oligarchs who own the oil and gas companies don't suffer in the same way. They have diversified portfolios. They have international assets. They can move their money around the globe. The pain of economic contraction falls disproportionately on workers, on pensioners, on ordinary people who have no such flexibility. This is a fundamental feature of capitalism, not a bug. The system is designed to protect capital at all costs, even when that means impoverishing the majority. Additionally, Russia has pursued what we might call austerity-light policies for decades. Public services have been chronically underfunded. Regional disparities have widened dramatically. If you live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, you have access to resources and opportunities. But if you live in a regional city in the provinces, the situation is often dire. Hospitals are underfunded, schools lack resources, infrastructure crumbles, and this creates not just economic hardship, but psychological despair. It creates a sense that the system has abandoned you, that you don't matter, that your life is expendable. And when millions of people experience this simultaneously, when this becomes the collective experience of an entire class, the working class, then the conditions for uprising are created. Now I want to shift to something more psychological and social, but understand that this flows directly from the economic conditions I've just described. When people work in a system where they have no control over decisions that affect their lives, when they're told to simply accept whatever conditions the market or their employers impose, they experience what Marx called alienation. Alienation means being separated from your own labor. It means doing work that doesn't feel like it's genuinely yours, that doesn't express your creativity or your humanity, that doesn't serve your needs but only serves the profit of someone else. In Russia, as in capitalist systems everywhere, workers experience this acutely. A factory worker might spend 8 or 10 hours a day producing goods that will be sold for profit, most of which goes to an owner they'll never meet. A nurse might work exhausting shifts in an underfunded hospital, saving lives, while the profits generated by the hospital go to some oligarch or private equity firm. A teacher might educate young people under conditions of resource scarcity, knowing that their salary is a pittance compared to what executives or oligarchs earn. This is dehumanizing, and it's designed to be that way. Because a worker who sees themselves as having agency, as having the capacity to collectively determine their conditions, that worker is dangerous to the capitalist system. So the system works to convince workers that they're powerless, that resistance is futile, that this is just how things are. But there's a limit to how effective this psychological manipulation can be. When conditions deteriorate enough, when the gap between what people are told and what they actually experience becomes too large, the ideological veil tears. And that's what we're seeing happening. Young Russians are looking at their futures and seeing no prospects. They're graduating from university into an economy where good jobs are scarce, where opportunity is rationed based on connections rather than merit, where the game is rigged from the start. They're experiencing what I call truncated futures, the sense that their lives will not improve, that they're trapped in precarity. This is incredibly destabilizing psychologically because humans have this fundamental need to feel agency, to feel that their actions matter, that their future is something they can influence. When the economic system systematically denies this to people, when it tells them your job is to work, to obey, to accept what you're given, eventually people rebel. The Kremlin has long maintained its legitimacy through two channels. First, through nationalism and patriotic ideology, the idea that Russia is great power, that Russians should be proud, that internal divisions are a luxury we can't afford. Second, through the delivery of basic economic security, the idea that even if you're not getting rich, at least you have stability, you have a job, you have a pension. But when both of these channels break down, when nationalism rings hollow in the face of personal economic despair, when stability means slowly impoverishing alongside everyone else, then the government loses its primary source of legitimacy. And that's where Russia is now. Now, I want to situate what's happening in Moscow within a global context because this is crucial. What we're seeing in Russia is not unique. It's part of a worldwide pattern that exposes something fundamental about how contemporary capitalism functions. In France, we've seen the Yellow Vest movement, millions of ordinary people protesting against economic inequality, against fuel taxes that hit working people hardest, against a system that seems designed to benefit the wealthy at everyone else's expense. In the United States, we've seen massive student debt protests, housing affordability crises, healthcare crises, underfunded public services alongside trillion-dollar military budgets and corporate bailouts. In Britain, we've seen austerity policies that have devastated public services while the wealthy continue to accumulate wealth. In Argentina, we've seen economic collapse caused by following International Monetary Fund prescriptions that enriched foreign investors and local oligarchs while destroying the middle class. Across the world, despite differences in specific contexts, we see a consistent pattern. The neoliberal model, the model of deregulation, privatization, austerity, and market fundamentalism, has failed to deliver prosperity for the majority. Instead, it's delivered increasing inequality, precarity, and desperation. The promise was simple: let markets work freely. Remove regulations, privatize everything, competition will drive efficiency, and everyone will benefit. This was the gospel according to Milton Friedman, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and their intellectual descendants. But this promise was based on a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate deception, about how capitalism actually works. What actually happened when regulations were removed was that corporations became more powerful, not less. What happened when public services were privatized was that they became more expensive, not more efficient. What happened when workers' ability to organize was suppressed was that their wages stagnated, not that the economy became more dynamic. Good afternoon. I want to start by making a simple but crucial observation. Whenever you see mass street protests in a country with a powerful authoritarian state apparatus, you're not looking at a passing moment of political theater. You're looking at the manifestation of something far deeper, the breakdown of an economic system's ability to reproduce itself. The events unfolding in Moscow right now are not primarily about politics. They're about economics. They're about the failure of a specific way of organizing production and distributing wealth to continue functioning without generating massive social conflict. Let me be very clear on this point from the beginning. The economy determines politics, not the reverse. When political analysts focus exclusively on who said what, on leadership personalities, on ideological debates, they're missing the fundamental driver. That driver is always material. It's about how people make their living, how resources are distributed, who benefits and who bears the costs. So when we look at Moscow, we need to ask, what economic system is failing? Why is it failing? Who profits from this system and who is destroyed by it? And crucially, what alternative possibilities are emerging as people refuse to accept the status quo? These are the questions that serious analysis must answer, and they're the questions I want to walk through with you today. To understand what's happening now, we have to go back to 1991, to the moment when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia embraced capitalism. Now, the Western narrative about this period is familiar to anyone who's paid attention to mainstream media. It goes something like this. The Soviet system was inefficient and authoritarian. It collapsed. Russia adopted market economics. This was traumatic, but it was the only path forward to prosperity and freedom. This narrative is profound nonsense, and it's important to understand why. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia didn't simply transition to capitalism. What actually occurred was something far more specific and far more destructive: the wholesale theft of public assets by a criminal oligarchy, coordinated with the Western powers and international financial institutions designed to incorporate Russia into a subordinate position within global capitalism. The statistics tell the story. Between 1990 and 1995, Russian GDP fell by approximately 50%. Real wages collapsed, life expectancy declined, mortality rates skyrocketed. Millions of people who had been educated, employed, and provided with housing and health care suddenly found themselves impoverished, unemployed, and desperate. This wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't the inevitable consequence of moving to a free market. This was the deliberate dismantling of a social system that had guaranteed basic material security, replacing it with a system designed to extract wealth upward to a tiny elite. The Soviet system, whatever its many failures and authoritarian characteristics, had built a comprehensive system of social provision. Everyone had housing, not always comfortable, but housing nonetheless. Everyone had work. There was universal health care and education. There were pensions for the elderly. There was a social safety net. Now understand what capitalism means when it liberalizes such a system. It means your housing was state-owned, now it will be privatized, and those who can't afford to buy their apartments will be homeless. It means your job was guaranteed by the state. Now you're subject to market forces and can be thrown into unemployment with no support. It means your health care and education were free. Now they're commodities that only the wealthy can reliably access. For the vast majority of Russians, capitalism has meant immiseration, and this immiseration has been structural, not accidental. It flows from the logic of capitalism itself. Let me describe how the Russian capitalist system actually functions, because this is essential to understanding the protests. When the Soviet Union collapsed, certain well-positioned individuals, people with connections to the Communist Party elite, people with access to state resources, people who understood how to navigate emerging power structures, moved rapidly to seize control of productive assets. The process was called privatization, which sounds neutral, technical. In reality, it was grand larceny on a historical scale. State enterprises, factories, mines, oil fields, communications infrastructure, banks, were transferred to private ownership. But this wasn't a competitive market process. This wasn't millions of Russians bidding for these assets. This was a coordinated transfer of ownership to a small number of oligarchs who had political connections and international financial backing. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank cheered this process on. Western economists and politicians proclaimed it as the path to prosperity, but they weren't interested in Russian prosperity. They were interested in incorporating Russia into the global capitalist system in a subordinate position as a source of raw materials and cheap labor, not as a developed economy. What emerged was oligarchic capitalism. This system has several defining characteristics. First, ownership is concentrated. A small number of individuals control the most productive assets: the oil and gas companies, the major banks, the telecommunications networks, the key industries. Second, this ownership is married to political power. The oligarchs finance politicians. Politicians protect oligarchic property through state power. This creates a symbiotic relationship between economic and political elites. Third, the system operates through systematic corruption and nepotism. Resources go to those with connections, not to those with competence or efficiency. Business contracts flow to friends and family. State positions are distributed as rewards to political allies. Fourth, and crucially, this system requires the suppression of working-class power. If workers could organize, if they could collectively bargain, if they could demand decent wages and conditions, this would cut into oligarchic profits. So the system functions by keeping workers atomized, desperate, and politically suppressed. The result is an economy structured around the extraction of maximum profit by the elite, funded by the immiseration of the working class. Now, here's the key point. This is not a failure of capitalism. This is capitalism functioning as designed. Capitalism in its pure form, without strong labor movements and social democratic constraints, produces exactly this result: massive inequality, concentration of wealth, political domination by the wealthy. Russia simply shows what capitalism looks like without the social democratic restraints that existed in Western Europe after World War II. Now, I want to get into the actual mechanics of how this exploitation functions, because understanding this is crucial to understanding why people are in the streets. In capitalism, workers create value. They go to work, they labor, they produce goods or services. The value of what they produce exceeds what they're paid in wages. This difference is called surplus value, and it's extracted as profit by the owner. This is how capitalism functions. It's not a moral failing or a glitch. It's the fundamental mechanism. Workers are always paid less than the value they create. The owner captures the difference. Now, in a boom period when the economy is growing and productivity is increasing, this can sometimes be obscured. There's enough growth that wages can rise even while profits rise faster. Conditions can improve for workers even as inequality grows. But in Russia, since the 1990s, this hasn't happened. We've had periods of economic growth, particularly in the 2000s when oil prices were high, but this growth has not translated into improved conditions for workers. Instead, productivity has increased while wages have stagnated or declined. This is the key to understanding the current crisis. Workers are being asked to produce more value while receiving less in return. Intensification of labor without compensation. This is fundamentally unsustainable. Additionally, Russia's economy is extremely vulnerable due to its dependence on oil and gas exports. When oil prices are high on the international market, government revenues increase. When oil prices fall, revenues crash. This creates boom-bust cycles that working people are forced to absorb. In boom times, workers see modest wage increases, maybe some hiring. In bust times, they face unemployment, wage cuts, public service reductions. Meanwhile, the oligarchs who own the oil companies weather these cycles by moving capital internationally, by diversifying their holdings, by protecting their wealth through tax havens and international financial networks. The working class bears all the risk and instability, while the wealthy insulate themselves from the consequences. This is the fundamental dynamic that has created the current crisis. Now let's talk about what this means in human terms, because economics isn't abstract. Economics is about how people live, whether they have enough to eat, whether they can afford medicine, whether they can send their children to school. For the vast majority of Russians, the past 3 decades have been a story of stagnation and decline. Real wages, and I want to emphasize real, meaning adjusted for what actually buys in the marketplace, have been essentially flat for years. In some sectors, they've declined. Meanwhile, inflation has been persistent. Prices for essential goods have risen significantly. What does this mean in practice? It means that a worker who made the same nominal salary 10 years ago is actually significantly poorer. Their purchasing power has declined. They can buy less. For families with modest incomes, which is most of the Russian population, this creates a state of perpetual crisis. Every month is a struggle. You're making calculations. Can we afford heat in the winter, or do we cut back on food? Can we get the child's medicine, or do we skip the dental work? Can we save anything for emergencies? This is the lived reality of economic stagnation for working people. It's not abstract. It's not theoretical. It's the actual experience of millions of people. Simultaneously, the wealth at the top has exploded. Russian oligarchs are among the richest people in the world. They own yachts that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. They have palaces in multiple countries. Their children study at elite universities in Switzerland and the United States. They move in circles where $1 billion is a modest fortune. The visibility of this inequality is crucial. In an older capitalism, the wealthy could hide their wealth in private estates. In contemporary capitalism, inequality is displayed constantly. The oligarchs flaunt their wealth. Gleaming towers in Moscow, financed by oligarch-connected corporations, rise alongside crumbling public hospitals. Private shopping malls serve the wealthy, while working-class neighborhoods lack basic services. This creates something profound, not just material hardship, but the experience of systemic injustice. People see that there's enough wealth to provide decent housing, health care, education for everyone. They see that the oligarchs are demonstrating this abundance daily through their ostentatious consumption. Yet they're told there's no money for public services, no money for wage increases, no money for pensions. This generates a kind of moral outrage that's more powerful than mere economic hardship. People understand that they're being robbed. They understand that the system is rigged. There's a particular dimension of the current crisis that's worth emphasizing: what's happening to young people. A young Russian today graduates from school and faces a labor market with few good options. The promising careers that existed under the Soviet system, the career tracks that led to middle-class stability, don't exist in the same form anymore. Unemployment and underemployment among youth are significant. Those who do find work often face precarious conditions: low pay, no job security, no benefits. The idea of working your way up a career ladder to build a comfortable life seems increasingly impossible. Meanwhile, housing prices have risen dramatically. A young person earning a modest salary has essentially no prospect of ever owning an apartment. Rent consumes an outsized portion of income. Many young people have to live with parents well into adulthood because they simply cannot afford to establish independent households. This creates what I call truncated futures. Young people look ahead and see nothing but stagnation, precarity, and difficulty. They're told repeatedly, you need to work hard, you need to get educated, you need to play by the rules. But they watch the rules being broken systematically by the wealthy, and they see that even if they play by the rules, the system offers them no security. This is profoundly destabilizing psychologically. Humans have a fundamental need to feel that their future is something they can shape, that their efforts can lead to improvement, that there's a path forward. When an economic system systematically denies this to entire generations, you create a population with nothing to lose, and that's where revolution comes from. Not from desperation alone. Desperation can be managed through repression and propaganda, but from the combination of desperation with consciousness, with the realization that the game is rigged, that the rules don't apply equally, that fundamental change is necessary. That's what we're seeing among young Russians. They're concluding, quite rationally, that the existing system has no future for them. Now, I want to discuss how a state maintains control over its population. This is important because understanding this shows us why we're at a crisis point. Sociologists and political theorists talk about legitimacy, the idea that a government rules because people accept its right to do so. This acceptance can be based on different foundations. It might be based on democratic participation. People feel they have a voice in decisions. It might be based on delivering material prosperity. The government may not be democratic, but it's making my life better. It might be based on nationalism and cultural identity. We're united as a people against external enemies. The Kremlin, particularly under Putin, has based its legitimacy on several of these foundations simultaneously. First, on the promise that while political democracy might be limited, the government would deliver economic stability and growing prosperity. Second, on nationalism and the idea that Russia is a great power asserting itself against Western domination. Third, on the suppression of alternative voices and the consolidation of state power. This model worked more or less during the 2000s when oil prices were high and the economy was growing. People had jobs, wages were rising, there was a sense that things were improving. The government could command loyalty through a combination of improved material conditions, nationalist rhetoric, and repression of dissent. But this model is breaking down. Economic growth has slowed. Wages have stagnated. The promise that capitalism would deliver prosperity has been revealed as hollow for the vast majority. Nationalism has worn thin when confronted with the reality of personal economic despair. When a government loses legitimacy in this way, it faces a choice. It can attempt to address the underlying material causes of discontent by redistributing wealth, improving wages, strengthening public services. This would require the ruling class to sacrifice some of its power and privilege. Or it can attempt to maintain control through repression and propaganda, hoping to suppress dissent until conditions change. The Kremlin has clearly chosen the second path, but this is where we encounter the limit of state control. Let's examine the Kremlin's response to the protests because it's revealing. The government has deployed the full apparatus of state repression, mass arrests, torture allegations, censorship of independent media, surveillance, intimidation of protesters and their families. The entire security apparatus has been mobilized to suppress dissent. Now, Western liberals often interpret this as a sign of strength. Look how powerful the Russian state is, how effectively it crushes opposition. But this analysis is superficial and wrong. Actually, mass repression is a sign of weakness. It's a sign that the state cannot rule through consent. It's a sign that legitimacy has collapsed and the regime must resort to coercion. Think about it logically. If a government genuinely enjoyed the support of its people, why would it need to arrest protesters? Why would it need to censor independent media? Why would it need to intimidate citizens? A confident government engages criticism. It's secure enough to tolerate dissent. But when a government cannot tolerate any opposition, when it must criminalize protests, when it must jail organizers, when it must create a climate of fear, this reveals that the regime knows its legitimacy is paper thin. Moreover, repression has inherent limits and costs. In the short term, yes, you can break up protests and jail organizers. You can create enough fear that people are reluctant to speak openly. You can silence certain voices, but you cannot suppress the economic contradictions that generate protest in the first place. You cannot make stagnant wages rise through repression. You cannot make inflation disappear through censorship. You cannot solve unemployment through arrests. Every person detained becomes a symbol of state violence. Their families and communities remember. Stories circulate through underground networks. You're not actually eliminating opposition. You're radicalizing it, pushing it deeper, creating networks of solidarity forged through shared suffering. Additionally, repression has severe economic costs. A society where people are afraid to speak, where surveillance is pervasive, where independent thought is discouraged, such a society cannot innovate, cannot grow, cannot develop the social trust necessary for economic dynamism. Skilled workers emigrate, investment declines, public morale deteriorates. The appearance of control masks a deeper erosion of the state's actual capacity. So the Kremlin faces a fundamental dilemma. It can't address the material basis of discontent without surrendering power, and it can't suppress dissent indefinitely without accelerating the very decay that generates discontent. This is the contradiction that reveals the regime's fundamental weakness. The Kremlin's official narrative about the protests is instructive. Officials claim that the protests are orchestrated by foreign powers, that they're the result of Western interference, that protesters are agents of foreign intelligence. This deflection strategy serves multiple purposes, and it's worth understanding why regimes resort to it. First, it attempts to delegitimize protesters by reframing their grievances as foreign imposed rather than genuine. You think you're protesting for legitimate reasons, but actually you're being manipulated by foreign powers. Second, it invokes nationalism as a defense mechanism. Yes, conditions are difficult, but that's because we're under attack from hostile foreigners. We need to unite as a nation. Internal criticism is disloyalty. Third, it absolves the ruling class of responsibility. The problem isn't our policies or our corruption or our extraction of wealth. The problem is foreign interference. But here's the crucial point. This deflection strategy is only deployed when a regime cannot address the actual causes of discontent. If the ruling class could simply improve wages, improve public services, reduce inequality, and rebuild public trust, they would do so. The fact that they instead resort to blaming foreigners reveals that they're unwilling to address the material conditions driving protest. Why are they unwilling? Because to genuinely address inequality and economic stagnation would require the oligarchic class to surrender wealth and power. It would require redistributing the enormous fortunes they've accumulated. It would require subordinating profit to human welfare. And they're not going to do that. So instead, they deploy nationalism and the specter of foreign threats to try to suppress internal dissent. The problem is that this strategy is becoming less and less effective because people can see through it. They understand that foreign interference doesn't affect their ability to pay rent or buy food. They understand that whatever the West is doing or not doing, their government is directly responsible for policies that have impoverished them. And when propaganda ceases to correspond to lived reality, propaganda loses its power. Now, I want to situate what's happening in Russia within a global context because this is crucial to understanding the deeper significance of these events. What we're seeing in Moscow is not an isolated phenomenon. It's part of a global wave of resistance to capitalism and to the neoliberal model that has dominated globally for the past 4 decades. In France, we've seen the Yellow Vest movement, millions of ordinary people protesting against inequality, against regressive tax policies, against a system that enriches the wealthy while immiserating the working class. In the United States, we've seen massive student debt protests, housing crises, healthcare crises, the emergence of socialist politics among young people, recognition that the system is broken. In Spain, we've seen indignado movements. In Greece, massive resistance to austerity. In Argentina, recurring economic crises and popular uprisings. In Turkey, Hong Kong, Chile, everywhere, we're seeing the same pattern. The neoliberal model, deregulation, privatization, austerity, the subordination of all human concerns to the logic of profit. This model is breaking down globally. It's not delivering the promised prosperity. It's delivering inequality, precarity, and desperation for the vast majority while concentrating wealth at the top. And everywhere, people are concluding that the system is fundamentally broken and that something different is necessary. Russia's particular form of this global crisis is oligarchic capitalism, but the underlying dynamic is the same as in the United States, where we have billionaires hoarding impossible wealth while workers struggle with healthcare and housing costs. It's the same as in Europe, where austerity policies have devastated public services while banks are bailed out. It's the same globally. What makes Russia significant is that this contradiction has reached an especially acute form, and people are beginning to act on it. This has global implications. When resistance spreads in one of the world's major powers, when a population with a history of revolutionary struggle begins to challenge the system, this reverberates internationally. It emboldens movements elsewhere. It suggests that the system is vulnerable globally. Now I want to address something that's emerging from the protests and from the broader global upheaval, the development of new political consciousness and the imagination of alternatives. What we're seeing is people beginning to move beyond a certain kind of trapped consciousness. They're moving beyond the idea that the choice is between capitalism and state socialism, between, on one hand, the oligarchic system we have now, and on the other hand, a return to Soviet-style centralized control. New possibilities are emerging. People are asking, could we have an economy that's neither run by oligarchs for their profit nor run by a centralized state? Could we have an economy that's democratically controlled by workers and communities? These aren't utopian fantasies. There are real-world models for this kind of economic organization. Worker cooperatives, for instance, an enterprise collectively owned by those who work in it, where decisions are made democratically, where profits are distributed equitably among those who created them. These exist and function successfully. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain is a federation of cooperatives with tens of thousands of workers, and it operates profitably in global markets while maintaining democratic control and equitable distribution. Participatory economics, where communities collectively decide what should be produced and how resources should be allocated. This requires a much higher level of democratic participation than exists in capitalism, but it's theoretically and practically coherent. Ecological socialism, which recognizes that the capitalist obsession with endless growth on a finite planet is unsustainable, and which prioritizes human welfare and environmental sustainability over profit accumulation. These alternatives aren't just theoretical. They're being experimented with right now in various parts of the world. Worker cooperatives exist. Community land trusts exist. Municipal socialism exists. People are building alternatives in the cracks and spaces of the existing system. What the Moscow protests suggest is that if a genuinely revolutionary movement emerged, one capable of contending for state power, these alternatives could be scaled up. They could become the organizing principle for a whole economy. This is the deep significance of the protests. They're not just about getting better wages under the existing system. They're about the possibility of fundamentally transforming the system itself. Here's where I want to address something that's crucial and often glossed over in discussions of protest movements: the distinction between spontaneous outbursts of anger and organized movements capable of achieving fundamental change. The protests in Moscow are currently significant in that they represent an eruption of anger against the system, but they haven't yet coalesced into a sustained, organized movement with a clear vision and strategic capacity. This is where history teaches us crucial lessons. Spontaneous protests can shake a system. They can temporarily force concessions, but without organization, without political education, without the development of alternative institutions and structures, they tend to be suppressed or contained. The Russian working class faces a particular challenge here. Unlike in some other countries, there's no strong tradition of independent labor unions, no legacy of strong socialist or communist parties genuinely representing working class interests, no established organizational infrastructure. Building such infrastructure would be the work of years. It would require the development of independent labor organizations capable of coordinating strikes and collective bargaining, the articulation of a clear political program and vision for what should replace capitalism, the building of alternative institutions, worker councils, community organizations, independent media, international coordination with movements in other countries, education and political development, helping people move from spontaneous anger to systematic understanding. This is difficult work, but it's the work that's necessary to move from temporary disruption to fundamental transformation. I want to spend a moment reflecting on how historical transformations actually occur, because this is important for understanding what might come next. Major social transformations don't happen quickly. They don't happen because a charismatic leader emerges and leads people to liberation. They happen through long processes of organizing, of consciousness building, of the development of alternative institutions and structures. The transition from feudalism to capitalism took centuries. The transition from capitalism to socialism, wherever it succeeded, has been decades-long struggles. This is important because it means we shouldn't expect the Moscow protests to immediately overthrow the Kremlin or transform Russia's economic system. But we should recognize that these protests are part of a long process of historical transformation that's underway globally. The capitalist system is in deep crisis. The contradictions are becoming unbearable. The inequality is becoming intolerable. The environmental destruction is accelerating. Something has to give. But what replaces capitalism will be determined through struggle, and it will be determined by the consciousness and organization of ordinary people. The ruling class will use every tool at their disposal to preserve the system: repression, propaganda, co-optation, nationalism, religious fundamentalism, whatever works. They have resources and power on their side. But they have one fundamental weakness. They depend on the labor and cooperation of ordinary people to reproduce the system. When ordinary people withdraw that cooperation, when they refuse to be complicit, when they organize alternative structures, the ruling class's power becomes fragile. This is the revolutionary potential in moments like we're seeing in Moscow. Not the immediate prospect of overthrowing the state, but the beginning of a long process of building alternative power from below. I want to conclude by addressing something that might seem pessimistic in what I've said: the difficulty of fundamental change, the power arrayed against transformation, the long time frame required. But actually, I want to argue that there's profound reason for hope, because the material conditions for transformation are present and deepening. The capitalist system is producing its own gravediggers. By concentrating wealth at the top, by impoverishing the majority, by creating a working class with nothing to lose, capitalism is generating the conditions for its own transcendence. We have the technology, the resources, and the productive capacity to ensure that every human being has their needs met. We have the means to dramatically reduce working hours. We have the possibility of building societies based on human flourishing rather than profit accumulation. The only thing preventing this is the concentration of power in the hands of oligarchs in states that serve their interests. And that concentration is becoming more and more obviously unjust and unnecessary. Every protest, every act of resistance makes this clearer. What's happening in Moscow is people saying, "No, we refuse. This system doesn't work for us, and we won't continue accepting it." And when that consciousness spreads, when it deepens, when it becomes organized, transformation becomes possible. This isn't guaranteed. The ruling class might succeed in suppressing the movement. Capitalism might stumble along for decades more, generating suffering and crisis. Or worse, reactionary forces might exploit the crisis to establish fascistic alternatives. But what's clear is that the old order is straining under its own weight. New possibilities are emerging. The question of what replaces capitalism will be answered not by elite politicians or economists, but by ordinary people organizing collectively for their liberation. So let me bring this to conclusion. What we're witnessing in Moscow is not simply a political moment. It's an economic reckoning. It's the moment when an oligarchic capitalist system that has delivered decades of immiseration for the majority confronts a population that has decided it will no longer tolerate this arrangement. The Kremlin will attempt to suppress this through force and propaganda. And in the short term, these methods might succeed. But the underlying contradictions remain. The economic system remains fundamentally broken. The interests of the oligarchs remain fundamentally opposed to the interests of ordinary people. And history teaches us that when a system loses legitimacy this thoroughly, when the gap between ideology and reality becomes this wide, when ordinary people begin to assert their collective agency, the days of the old order are numbered. What will replace it remains to be determined. It will depend on whether the Moscow protests develop into a sustained, organized movement. It will depend on whether a vision of genuine alternatives emerges. It will depend on whether working people in Russia connect their struggle to broader global resistance. But what seems clear is that the age of oligarchic capitalist rule in Russia is entering its twilight. the people are beginning to move. And when they do, all the security forces and all the propaganda in the world cannot hold back history. The Moscow uprising is thus not an endpoint, but a beginning. It's the beginning of a deeper reckoning with what kind of society Russia will be and what kind of world we will create. That reckoning will unfold over years and decades, but it has begun, and that matters more than any current political outcome or state repression could suggest. The working people of Russia are reclaiming their historical agency. They're refusing to be treated as expendable instruments of profit. They're asserting that a different world is possible, a world based on democracy, equality, and human dignity rather than oligarchic exploitation. That is a profound historical development, and it's one that should give hope and inspiration to everyone globally who recognizes that capitalism has failed and that something genuinely different is necessary. The struggle continues, and from Moscow to New York, from Paris to Beijing, from London to Sao Paulo, millions of people are engaged in the same fundamental struggle. The struggle to build a world where human needs are prioritized over profit accumulation, where communities control their own destinies, where democracy is genuine and not merely a formal shell-hiding elite rule. The Moscow protests are a chapter in that larger story, and that story is still being written.